Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances in the east and the Ukrainian Kursk offensive continues in the north. We'll start out with the Russian advances in the east since there hasn't been an update on this the past 2 days. We start out in the direction of Vuhledar, where the Russians have managed to advance on a wider part of the front line in between the foothold they've gained on the road between Konstantinivka and Vuhledar and towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the central parts. The Russians will likely target Vuhledar before they go down to Vuhledar, and will also likely push towards Konstantinivka, as we've already seen fighting take place in the eastern outskirts and southern outskirts of the town. The Russians will likely look to widen the front, similar to what they did by Vuhledar, where after they got a foothold in the east, they widened it to the south, then attacked in the northern parts, which eventually led to the Russian capture of the town. We are likely going to see a similar tactic here as the Russians have pushed south of Pobeda to look to gain control of fortified positions and gain control over the northern parts of Konstantinivka, at the same time as they flank from the south and attack from the east, where they've already gained a foothold. Same with the Vuhledar direction, the Russians look to gain control over Vuhledar, push along the east of Vuhledar, and eventually reach the northern, eastern, and southern parts of the town before storming it to gain control of it. Moving on, in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, we see the Russians have advanced in several directions. They've captured about half of Shelane. That means that over half of it is now under Russian control, with the parts that they already had under their control. This has led to the Ukrainians being pushed to the southern and eastern outskirts of the town, and they will be forced to withdraw to Novoshelane or Kursk further south, as the Russians already have control over the roads to the east, which will prevent them from moving on to the fortified positions, and it is unlikely that they will even want to move in that direction, as they'll also be soon forced to withdraw from these positions if the Russians move further south towards Kursk and Novoshelane from the east. The Russians also moved a bit further from the railways, but the main push was in the direction of Serhiivka, where the Russians managed to capture the rest of the village, the entirety of it, and move on to fight by the fortified position between Serhiivka and Vuhledar further west. They have also advanced northwest of Vesele towards Vuhledar itself, which is one of the two main bastions of Ukrainian defense in this section of the front line. Vuhledar in the north and Vuhledar in the south are the two bastions of Ukrainian defense, and the Russians will be looking to gain control over these, the fortified positions in between them, and then move on to Mironograd and Pokrovsk itself. There's no other significant fortified positions between the Russian positions in the east and Pokrovsk in the west. At the same time, the Russians will also move down south towards Selidove, widening the front and attacking that town as well. Selidove is one of the towns which the Ukrainians have been using as an outpost, not because it's heavily fortified, but simply because logistics go through that place, and therefore the Russians have hit this multiple times in the past. For one of those times, it was claimed that hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers were hit, and that is the very one that was so far from the front line, it is now just a few kilometers from it. So we see that the Russians have managed to capture Serhiivka and half of Shelane. Now we see in the north, they have also captured the majority of Ivanivka, where the Ukrainians are now pushed to the western outskirts, again in the direction of Vuhledar, as the Russians are moving in that direction. At the same time, the Russians have captured the fortified positions east of Lysychne, which means that the Russians will then move on to Lysychne itself, the fortified position southwest of it, and move along the riverline towards Svirodonivka. So we see the Russians have advanced all across the Pokrovsk section of the front line in the most recent developments. So we see heavy fighting is still taking place in the east and is not disrupted by the Ukrainian Sumy offensive. At the same time, we see here in the direction of Bilohorivka, there's been this small advance in the northern parts in the heights, where the Russians have regained control of this area after it has switched hands a dozen times between the Russians and the Ukrainians, constantly fighting over it. Moving back to the Kursk offensive here in the north, the Ukrainians have advanced further in three separate areas. In the north, towards Nikolsky and Viktorovka, further south towards Luknia along the river line, And finally, in the direction of Sudzha, where the Ukrainians had captured all of the village and some of the surrounding villages, like Podol to the south and Saulishenki to the north, and Saulishenka further north is being contested, but mostly under Ukrainian control. The front line has aligned along the Reka-Sudzha river line, which goes through Sudzha and separates the eastern and western parts, where the Ukrainians will then move on to enter Samuste and then move along that to combine and open up for a crossing towards Mirnie here in the east, where the next Russian defensive line is currently the river line they are using as a defensive line, and beyond that it is the railway line itself that they'll use as a defensive line. And if we take a look at the topographic map, we can see that the Sudzha is right here, the river line that goes beyond it, right to the east of it, and that is a height elevation of 139 meters. The village by the railways is at about 150 meters, so there's not much difference, it's just a slight height advantage, but beyond it there is these hills, which are located at a height of 210 meters, so this is a 70 meter advantage to the current Ukrainian positions, and a 60 meter advantage to the railway line. This is why the railway line is used as a defensive line, because if the Russians are able to slow down the Ukrainians along the railway line, they'll have a 60 meter advantage by occupying the heights. It will also be difficult for the Ukrainians to move along the river line here further north, as the Russians are located in the heights at an elevation of 216 meters, and northwest of the currently held positions of the Ukrainians along the border area are at the low ground at about 152 meters, and the Russian positions are at heights of about 227 meters, so there is a 60 meter, 70 meter advantage there as well. So currently the Ukrainians are facing off the Russians, where all of the Ukrainian positions are in the low ground and all of the Russian positions are in the high ground. The initial Ukrainian push took control over the high ground positions, and this has allowed them to quickly attack and take control over Russian positions in the low grounds, but now they are going to be slowed down significantly by the Russian high ground. On top of that, the situation has been clarified. The reason for the Ukrainian offensive, why it happens right now, and everything else has been clarified after my communication with my sources in the Ukrainian and Russian army. It seems that the Russians, as has been previously reported, were removing mines near the Sumy border. The reason for this is similar to the Kharkiv offensive. The Russians were planning a Sumy offensive directly towards the city itself, and it will likely be similar in nature. No significant push, but somewhere where they can get a foothold across and establish some positions and then turn to the defensive. The Ukrainians noticed this, just as it was pretty much publicly reported that the Russians were removing the mines. But then again, the Russians did not think much of it because, well, they did the same, and it was also noticed in the Kharkiv region, but nothing happened. So the Russians continued removing mines. They did so in the cover of night, and it did so over a long period of time because they have to make sure that all of the mines are gone so that they are not going to be hit by friendly fire by the mines. So about a month-long period of time, maybe more, maybe less, somewhere around there, they were busy removing mines. This is something that was reported on, and this is something widely known. So the Ukrainians thought of this as the perfect opportunity. Instead of waiting for the Russians to drive in and take control over parts of the Sumy region, they'll take the initiative and hit the Russians before they launch their offensive, while the minefields are gone, to take advantage of that operation. This means that the Kursk offensive is simply a preemptive strike on the Russians. However, this also means that Russian troops are nearby, because the Russians weren't just gonna remove the mines and then sit by and watch. They were planning on actually launching a Sumy offensive. This means that there are some units that are going to launch this offensive. However, they will be staying away from the front line for 3 reasons. First one is that they don't want them to be detected. The second reason is that they don't want them to see the size of this unit. And the third reason is that they don't want their units to be struck by Ukrainian long-range, whether it is missiles, drones, or whatever. So they are far away out of that range, but not that far away that they aren't completely ready and going to move in to cover the front. This is why no units are being moved from the Kharkiv front, from the eastern front, from the southern front, because the Russian units are already available in this section of the front line. The Russian tactic has not changed. Their objective has not changed. It has simply changed its nature. The Russians already had units somewhere in the area, not exactly sure where, but far from the front line to avoid getting hit by and detected by Ukrainians. Therefore, they will quickly move into position and establish a front line, after which the operation will begin, not just to kick the Ukrainians out of the Kursk region, but also to enter the Sumy region and establish a foothold and create their Kharkiv offensive in the Sumy region. Therefore, we are likely going to see that the Ukrainian advances will slow down and that the Russians will actually start pushing them back and attempt to recapture the Kursk region and enter the Sumy region. Therefore, the toughest battles and the hardest battles in the Kursk region have yet to begin, and the Russians will send a significant force here, not from other sections of the front line, but those who are already planned to be used in this direction anyways. Therefore, we can see that the Ukrainians, with their success, is simply because there were almost no Russian soldiers in the area. Although there are fortified positions, the number of Russian soldiers in the area was the minimum possible because it was only border guards and a few recon units, FPV drone operators, and so on. The actual main force was in the rear, preparing for their own offensive. This is why this offensive was very well performed by the Ukrainians, because they attacked at the very best moment possible. But this also means it will not be a repeat of the Kharkiv offensive, where the Ukrainians managed to capture large parts of Russian-held territory and push them beyond. Instead, the Russians will rapidly respond. This all has happened within 2 days, and it will likely significantly slow down today, and it may even reverse today or tomorrow. Generally, the situation will not be favorable for the Ukrainians for much longer, as the Russian main army will be deployed. Something to notice about the Ukrainian soldiers is that it is not the GRU, GUR, whatever they're called. It's not any of those RDK units either. These are the Ukrainian ground forces. This is why there's been no TikTok videos, there's been no filming crew and so on for this sort of adventure where they claim, oh, we have liberated the Russian Republic or People's Republic of Kursk. I don't know why the naval charts make this into a communist People's Republic. Maybe they are all communists. Either way, this is the Ukrainian ground forces, and it's not just the ground forces. They are blue banders. The difference between blue banded Ukrainian soldiers and yellow banded Ukrainian soldiers is that the yellow banded are the ones who are mobilized. They receive the worst equipment and the least training. The blue banded are either recruited into, volunteers into, or mobilized into the units within the Ukrainian armed forces. What this means is that they have special units, whether it is the Kraken or all of these different units they have within Ukraine, who received a lot of donations, who receive a lot of weapons, who are prioritized by the Ukrainian government. They also allow their recruits to train for much longer and receive much better equipment. Therefore, they are on a different league than the meat shields, really, that are being sent elsewhere. So these are the elite forces of the Ukrainian army that moved into the Kursk region. And this is exactly why the Ukrainian soldiers in the east are very, very angry about this. Because there's no purpose to this other than this preemptive strike. It may help the Sumy region slightly, or we don't really know what sort of effect it will have. It could be very successful, it could also be a failure. We'll have to wait, time will tell. But regardless of that, the Ukrainian soldiers in the east are very angry because the Russians are constantly advancing. In the Tversk section, New York section, and Pokrovsk section of the front line, they're constantly advancing. They are struggling very hard to hold back or even slow down the Russians. Yet the Ukrainians moved into Kursk. And that is to the point where I quote a sentence from a soldier on the Ukrainian side in the east, who said, "What fucking Kursk? We don't have anything. What the hell are we doing? And what the hell is going on? It's a betrayal from all sides." Naturally, not everyone needs to understand why and the purpose of every single military operation, but launching such an operation, reserving the best equipment for these types of soldiers who are going to enter the Kursk region without explaining anything really. They have yet to even recognize that they've entered the Kursk region, yet the soldiers in the east are struggling to even hold the front line, and they're struggling to prevent a collapse of the eastern front. Yet they see and hear about a Kursk incursion, and they think, what the hell? And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.